what do I want to accomplish when I'm working on myself? And for me, what I've seen through the years, the most important aspect of working on ourselves comes down to working with feelings. And this seems to be the prevalent conception in therapy today. Therapy is usually centered around releasing trapped negative feelings. There are other aspects to therapy as well, such as strengthening a sense of identity, strengthening boundaries, learning how to manage experiences. But most therapists today, I think, agree that releasing feelings that are trapped and held, suppressed, as we say, from previous experiences is the main focus of therapy. And at that point, there may be different approaches in which a therapy session will attempt to release feelings, but the goal is usually the same. It's releasing feelings. Now, as we, for example, as we have come along on the spiritual path, many of us on the spiritual path have not really been exposed to working with feelings. As you get into a spiritual discipline, whether it's meditation, such as yoga meditation or Buddhism, or something like A Course in Miracles, for example, which is very popular these days, there's a real strong education in what we could call the spiritual aspects of ourselves, which may be latent at this point. But often what happens, and this was my experience for many years, is that the need to work on myself in an emotional way, in a feeling way, really became obscured by the spiritual ideals that I was learning as part of the path that I was on. And I felt that what I wanted to do in my own work on myself was to gradually move myself into more of an experience of the spiritual aspects of myself. So whenever anything came up that didn't correspond to the concepts that I had in my mind of what I thought I should be like if I was going to be a spiritual person. And I use that term in a very general way. For me, spiritual meant actually moving into a sense of higher consciousness, opening up my consciousness, going beyond what I thought I perceived in myself as being a limited sense of ego. So moving into higher consciousness was my conception of a spiritual experience. In order to do that, I was doing yoga, I was meditating, I was trying to do karma yoga, which is essentially doing activity with no thought of gain from the activity, even any kind of subtle spiritual gain. But I wasn't really working on feelings in the beginning. So combining working with feelings with a spiritual practice is what my work is about these days. And again, when I say spiritual, I mean in the sense of broadening consciousness, wanting to become more aware of the sense of personal evolution that we're all on. Now, in order to work with feelings, but first what we have to do is we have to get to the point where we recognize that working with feelings is important. And many times when we're on our spiritual path, we become familiar with other techniques or other approaches in which we're trying to maximize or optimize our positive experience. This could include things like affirmations, positive visualizations, which have actually become very popular recently. And these are very powerful tools, but it's also very easy to misuse these tools. And misusing them, for me, would mean using them in a way to try to change our feeling experience. Using an affirmation, for example, to try to change what your emotional experience is a very misapplied way to use an affirmation. What it essentially amounts to is denying the emotional experience that you're having in yourself. And more as I stayed on my own particular path and became more and more familiar with Western psychotherapy, which emphasizes working with the feelings, I understood that I had to come into an experience of my feelings. And the experience of the feelings was necessary in order to allow the feelings to clear, which had been suppressed from some time in the past. And that's what suppression is, basically. You have an emotional experience, a feeling experience, but you don't allow yourself to fully have the feeling. And when a feeling is not allowed to come into consciousness in a really complete way, so that you really experience it on a deep level, then that feeling becomes what we call suppressed. And the energy of the feeling is what gets suppressed. Feelings are really composed of a very powerful energy that's usually in our astral body, or the emotional body, or the psychic body. It's not visible on the material plane, but we can certainly feel it in our more subtle bodies. But when this energy is not experienced, it becomes trapped and held within. And it becomes held within, waiting essentially for an opportunity to come up again in the future. And the opportunities that it connects onto or attaches onto, when that happens, what we call that is projection. We say that our emotional energy, we're now experiencing it in a projected way because we've denied the experience of it inside ourselves. We've pushed it away, or we've not allowed it to really reach the point of clearing inside of ourselves. That energy now gets projected, and we tend to perceive it as if it's coming to us from the outside. So what we think is that someone else is making us feel a certain way. We think that someone else is making us angry, or we think that because someone is not here for us, we're experiencing loneliness. Or because we're not getting the recognition that we think we need, we're experiencing a sense of invalidation or even worthlessness. So the first important thing is to realize that all these feelings, all these emotions, got trapped in the past someplace. And if we have a chronic problem now with a certain kind of emotion, we can be sure that that's the circumstance, that we trapped it, we suppressed it in the past, and now it keeps coming up in the present, in our present circumstances. We project it onto the people around us, the circumstances around us, and even more than that, we attract those circumstances to ourselves that correspond to that suppressed emotional energy. So if we're experiencing a lot of, let's say, worthlessness, a power center condition, what we do is attract circumstances to us that tend to validate the feeling of worthlessness. And we do that in order to bring up the feeling of worthlessness within ourselves so that it can be cleared. This is the way the projection mechanism works. We attract circumstances to ourselves that correspond to the feeling in order to bring up the feeling within. And in psychology, we call this compulsion repetition. We keep drawing the same kinds of people to us, even though we are trying not to. We keep finding ourselves in situations of failure, for example, even though we certainly don't want to, in order to bring up the feelings that correspond to that particular circumstance. So what's important to recognize is why would we want to have a feeling of worthlessness or a feeling of failure or a feeling of loneliness. Of course, we don't want those feelings. But what we don't understand is that our experience on the material plane and our emotional experience as it relates to the material plane is a dualistic kind of experience. In other words, it's always going to be composed of a negative side and a positive side. Now, this doesn't mean that that half our experience has to be negative. It just means that we have to allow a place for the negative in our lives and recognize that the experience of the negative is necessary in order for us to be able to experience the positive. We have to experience loneliness in a certain way in order to appreciate what it means to be able to be close to someone. We wouldn't know what it was like to be close to someone unless we had the experience of loneliness. We wouldn't know what it was like to experience success and fulfillment on a power center level unless we also had a knowledge of the sense of insignificance and failure. But because we've suppressed those negative experiences, so-called negative experiences, the loneliness, the worthlessness, the sense of failure, we haven't allowed those feelings to clear, then they keep attracting the circumstances to us in order to bring up those feelings. So you can see if you're working with affirmations, for example, in trying to change your experience, if you're working with affirmations for prosperity, they can work to a certain point, but what's happening is you're really trying to get rid of the emotional experience by changing your experience in the outer world. For example, you're trying to change your experience of prosperity, but with an affirmation to bring more things into your life in direct response to your experience of the lack of prosperity. So what happens is we become compulsive. We experience a negative feeling, like loneliness or lack of prosperity, and we become driven by that experience, and we use things like affirmations, which can be beneficial when used correctly, but we use them compulsively in order to get rid of the negative feelings that we're carrying around. And affirmations won't work in this particular situation. They won't help you get rid of the negative feelings. Actually, what they do is just keep bringing up the negative feelings. So how to deal with these negative feelings is what it comes down to. And that's what I've written my book about, and that's what I work with clients, and in the workshops that I lead. We go into very specific ways, actually a training. In my workshops, I give a training on how to approach these feelings very specifically. When I'm working with clients, we're doing the same thing. We're working on specific issues and we're going very deeply, but it's also a training, a learning of an approach that you can use throughout your life to clear feelings and not have to be motivated by them into thinking that you're going to change what your experience is on the material plane and thinking that's going to change your emotional experience. It's not. You have to deal with the emotions directly. So the way you do that is by basically moving into an experience of your feelings on the emotional level. It means allowing your feelings to happen. It means feeling your feelings, basically. It sounds very simple, and basically it is simple, but it gets confusing because we've been so conditioned to resist our feelings. Just the very simplest thing of being with our feelings, allowing our feelings to be, is very difficult for us. It's really all we have to do to clear feelings. When a feeling comes up, when your anger comes up, when your loneliness comes up, it just means opening to the feeling and allowing yourself to have it. And it's easiest to do this usually in meditation. And when I say meditation, I mean just sitting quietly, doing nothing. You don't have to do any particular kind of meditation. Just sitting quietly, doing nothing. That's really what meditation is. And when you do that, the mind tends to settle down. And as the mind settles down, the next layer, the next level that we go into tends to be the feeling level, the emotional level. The chatter that's going on in the mind quiets down, and then we become aware of the emotions that are behind. And that's the point where we can open to our feelings and experience them and allow them to clear. Now, in order to do that, there are several tools that I teach, including breath work. I recommend some kind of body work, for example, doing yoga. That loosens up the body and enables us to become conscious of the emotional energy. Usually we're unconscious of it because we've suppressed it, pushed it back into what we call the unconscious, and it only comes forward at certain times. Now, in order to process a feeling, processing a feeling is how I refer to working with a feeling in order to clear it. Processing includes feeling the feeling, but there are other aspects to processing as well. And this is what I describe in detail in my book. I'm just going to summarize those now in the time that we have. The 4 steps that I consider to be essential for a feeling to clear are awareness, acceptance, direct experience, and what I call transformation, the 4th step. I'm just going to go through all those with a little more detail right now. The first step, awareness, means, first of all, becoming aware of the feeling. And many times we're not even aware of our feelings. Our feelings are pushed into our subconscious. So recognizing when a feeling comes up, just saying, yeah, here's a feeling. And then a second part of awareness is taking responsibility for the feeling. Recognizing, especially when you're having a very powerful emotional experience, usually of a traumatic kind, an unpleasant kind. Those are the very ones that involve suppressed energy coming from the past. Those are the very ones where you're projecting onto your circumstances. So that when a feeling comes up in a situation with a close, intimate partner, in a job situation, for example, take responsibility for this emotion. Recognize that, yes, the person you're dealing with may be acting in a way that's less than desirable. Maybe his or her behavior could be modified. Maybe there's even some kind of abuse going on here. But take responsibility for your emotional reaction, for your feelings that are coming up. And taking responsibility for your emotional experience immediately puts you into a completely different orientation to your experience and to your experience on an outward level and to your experience on an inward level. You see that it's no longer somebody or something outside that's making you feel the way you are. It's just that these circumstances are bringing up the feelings that you've got trapped within. So it's much easier to get past the sense of blame that keeps us locked in these feelings, basically. So that's the first step, taking responsibility and becoming aware of the feeling. These 2 components happen on an intellectual level. intellectual level. We're not really moving into a feeling level yet. The second step, awareness, occurs on a behavioral level, or more of a mental level. This is the level where we get locked into patterns of behavior. And these patterns of behavior that we get locked into have the purpose of suppressing our emotions as they come up. An emotion comes up, we respond with a certain pattern that we've learned will suppress the feeling and push it back down into our unconscious. Now, what we have to do on the behavioral level, the acceptance level, is recognize what our patterns are and then modify them to whatever extent is possible. And often, it's not possible to modify behavior to any great extent because we're actually addicted to these patterns. But what we do is just recognize that the addiction is there, and then try to modify, and then work with the feeling. And what we do is clear the feeling in the techniques that we have. And as the feeling clears, it makes it no longer necessary for us to continue with these patterns of behavior. So that there's a link between the pattern of behavior and the feeling, and the suppression of the feeling. It's kind of a circle. We suppress, and then the feeling continues to be suppressed, and then continues to be projected, emerges from our subconscious. Then we go back into our pattern, we suppress the feeling again. It's a vicious cycle kind of thing. But if we just start loosening up the cycle at these various points by becoming aware of our patterns. Now, some of the patterns that we use to keep feelings suppressed are things like blaming. Blaming is a very common way. It's a dynamic, an energetic dynamic that goes out and that blocks the feeling. It goes out and blocks our experience outside of us from actually getting to us. So we're putting this wall around ourselves. And then it also blocks ourselves from seeing inside ourselves, from seeing and perceiving and feeling the emotions. All kinds of addictions on the sensation center, being locked into food, drink, drugs, sex. These are all ways that we bring in extra energy to keep the feeling suppressed. Things like living in the future, living in the past, looking for recognition outside of ourselves. These are all subtle ways that we fall into what I call a self-rejecting kind of behavior. And this self-rejection makes it impossible for us to really get to the feeling. As long as we're locked up into blame, as long as we're locked up into living in the future or living in the past, or any kind of concept about ourselves, including the spiritual concepts that I talked about earlier in the show. We have a concept about ourselves that we should be a certain way, that we should even be a loving person. And when that negative stuff comes up, we reject that part of ourselves. We reject that negativity, that anger, and we push it back down. So as we examine our self-rejection, move more into a place of self-acceptance, then we're able to open to the feelings in a meaningful way. We can open to the experience of the anger in our body, the experience of the loneliness in our body, in a gentle way, in a controlled way, in a way that's not too much for us. And we can extend the kind of self-acceptance, unconditional acceptance, to that emotional part of ourselves, which we may have been pushing away for very long periods in the past. And if this has been the case with you, just feel yourself now moving into more of an acceptance with your emotional self. All those feelings that you may have been pushing away, just allow them to be. and be with them. Just feel how good it feels to open to that side of yourself.